Hi, I'm Catherine Little. I'm a director at Campbell to Kell. Together with my colleague, Ceri Victory-Rowe, we're going to have a bit of a chat about consumer regulation, some of the challenges and how you might approach it. Ceri, what is all the fuss about? Why all this talk about consumer regulation?
The Social Housing Regulation Act, which got royal assent in July, is bringing into law some of the changes which the white paper the government issued in 2020 gave advance warning about. And it all stems really from the tragedy at Grenfell Tower. And out of the learning from that and other things that have happened subsequently, there's been a growing expectation, I think, that there should be a more proactive approach to consumer regulation. So the bit of regulation that deals with the quality of homes and services that are provided to tenants and residents in the social housing sector. There's been a more stringent approach over, in recent years to what's called economic regulation, the bit around governance and the money, than there has been to consumer regulation. And I think pressure, particularly understandably, from customers and residents to put consumer regulation on equal footing in the approach that the regulator takes. So there's been a consultation. It's just finished on new consumer standards. So there'll be a new set of standards that the regulators assessing compliance with, expecting the sector to comply with. And the regulator's got some new powers as well, including the power to carry out inspections where they'll be assessing compliance. So that's going to take off from April, and it'll build on the existing in-depth assessment IDA model, but it'll feel a little bit different because they'll be looking for housing associations. They'll be looking at the consumer standards and compliance with the consumer standards, as well as with the governance and the financial viability standard. And for local authorities, of course, it'll be the first time that the regulator of social housing has had this sort of role of actually going out, visiting, talking with people, seeing what's going on the ground and making their own assessment, and ultimately issuing a judgment which reflects how far they think that registered provider is complying with the consumer standards. There's quite a lot going on for organisations to get to grips with. What do you think, Catherine, some of the biggest challenges are going to be for the sector in responding to all of this?
I mean, I suppose you've just talked there about the sheer volume of stuff, to use a technical term, coming at people. And I do think there's something in that, Ceri. There's changes to consumer regulation through the standards now. We know coming down the line there's going to be a revised set of standards around decent homes, around access to information, around the professionalisation agenda. And that's in a tough economic environment, in which organisations are already up against a lot of challenges. I suppose in terms of consumer regulation, we're not seeing one single set of challenges. We're really hearing quite different issues for local authorities, ALMOs, and linked to local authorities, housing associations, and across the sizes of housing associations as well. So slightly different issues for very small providers from those that are a bit larger. For local authorities, I suppose there's something about just getting used to being regulated in a proactive way. Of course, the consumer standards have always applied, but it's been very much on a reactive basis, and only when that serious detriment test that has now gone has been breached that the regulator has been involved. So I think what we're hearing from local authorities is the need to get the mindset right around compliance, but also having the right assurance, the right evidence of compliance there, and that kind of line of reporting through to council as the accountable body. We know there's some quite practical issues around accessing the right skills, around the right technical skills, for example, for repairs, whether that's through a DLO or through a contractor, not to mention the cost of materials. And I suppose we're hearing quite a lot about the links between repairs and complaints, which also fits with a much more visible housing ombudsman and a much more proactive approach to encouraging customers and residents to complain when something is not right. So there's probably something there around how you deal with very practical issues that have an impact on your compliance with the standards. And then, sitting behind that, there are challenges around data, making sure your data's right, making sure it's of high quality, making sure it's giving you the information you need in order to make informed decisions about investment, about services, about homes. And of course, that you're doing that together with your customers and tenants. And I think that engagement piece is interesting because without doubt, some social housing providers have got really strong mechanisms and really strong relationships in place with their tenants and residents, and that's never changed. But there are others who are perhaps coming round to looking at engagement in a different way and thinking, actually, we really want to up our game on this to make sure we're really compliant and make sure tenant voices are heard in the boardroom. And, there's not one way to do that. There's no one size fits all. So I suppose there's a challenge around working with your tenants and residents in a really meaningful way so that their influence, their voices have a real impact on the services, homes and decisions that the landlord is making.
The regulator of social housing's been testing their approach, haven't they? So, inevitably there are some challenges for them in this as well. They've been conducting a pilot and we've worked with some of the organisations that have been involved in that pilot. What have we learned from that work, Catherine, about how registered providers can best prepare for the inspections that are coming down the line?
Right, I think I suppose there's a caveat around anything we say about the pilots, isn't there? Because we know you can't take as read a methodology that just because you know how it's being tested in the pilots. By their nature, they're a way of learning, and we know the regulators developed and refined its methodology as it's gone along. But there are certainly some lessons for the sector about preparing, and I'd say top of the list has got to be go back to first principles, look at the actual proposed consumer standards and simply do a gap analysis, check where you comply, check where you have good practice, fantastic, and check and be really honest, have a really good look in the mirror, check where you have gaps, and it's not rocket science, put a plan in place to improve it. I think the second point is probably around knowing your tenants. The regulator's being really clear that equality, diversity and inclusivity absolutely run throughout the standards, as do principles of respect and fairness. And you can't demonstrate those things without demonstrating that you know who's living in the homes you own and manage. So there's something around customer insight, equality data, and going beyond the TSMs as a tick box to say, what does this tell me? What sits behind the TSMs as a lens? What sits behind the complaints data? The best organisations we're hearing from the regulator are those that really marry up the property data with the people data and use that to make really well-informed, well-rounded decisions. And I suppose, that point around good quality data and robust assurance really, really matter. We heard from a couple of the pilots that they were almost a bit surprised, some not all, that they were being asked for board papers or council papers rather than actual checks on compliance. And the regulator's been really clear about what they're looking for is evidence that the board or council has assurance of compliance, not just compliance itself. So, take what I'm saying with a pinch of salt, but go back to first principles, know your tenants, make sure you've got the right data and think about assurance. What about you, Ceri? What would your top tips be? If you could give 3 top tips about consumer regulation, what would they be?
Yeah, I think the ones that you've given are very good. I suppose I'd add to that there's in a way there's nothing new in the consumer standards. Actually this is the bread and butter, isn't it, for social landlords? It's what they do every day. So I think it can be quite helpful to step back and remember that this is your business as usual, really. And the bit that's likely to be most challenging about all of this is the more proactive approach to it being regulated, which means that you've got to be really on top of identifying and articulating the assurance that you've got that you do this stuff. So the evidence, you've got to be able to satisfy yourselves that you're doing the stuff and you're doing it well, and you've got to be able to demonstrate that to the regulators. So the first tip is I think just make sure that you think very carefully about the evidence you've got, and you get that into order so you can see it well within your organisation. You can demonstrate it to the regulator. I think the second tip would be don't panic. If you're not in the position where you've got a good assurance framework, that's okay. Identify the fact that you haven't and make a plan to get to that point. If you know where the gaps are and you've got a plan to address them, you're going in the right direction, aren't you? You're doing the right thing. And if you don't know where the gaps are, I'd say consider getting some help. So support to do a really robust self-assessment. That's a good starting point. If you don't know your current position, that's what you need to focus on, rather than panicking about the bits where you're worried you might not be doing as much as you should be. And then the third thing I think would be listen to your tenants, which chimes with what you were saying, Catherine. It's so fundamentally important. They almost certainly already know where the gaps are. So if you ask them, that's a really good shortcut to finding out where the things are that you're not doing as well as you should be. So if you haven't got that insight already, if you're not asking your tenants, you're not listening to them, make sure that you've got a plan to do that, and co-create the way you're going to do that with your tenants if you can, because then they'll want to give you information. You're asking them in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that they'll welcome, and they can help you understand as well what the priorities are, so that when you know where the gaps are, you can get a steer from your tenants about what you should be addressing first, and I think that can be really helpful in coming up with a good plan.